Hello and welcome. In today's episode, I'm going to share stories where people aren't quite sure what they encountered. These stories include a young woman who shares a terrifying experience she had as a child, a man who had someone or something call out his name while camping, and a man who heard something running past his house one night. But first, we start with a story from a young man with something harassing him outside his home. Alright, let's get into today's stories. The first story of this episode comes to us from a poster who had a weird series of experiences outside his home. He shared his story online hoping to find answers about what it could have been. It all began when he saw what he believed to be either a dog or wolf's feet running down the road. He was unable to see because of the blinds. A few days after he saw the canine feet running on the road, he started hearing strange noises at various times, both day and night, that sounded like something was scurrying over the ventilation unit next to his house. Curious, he looked outside, but nothing was there, which made him feel uneasy. It was odd that no one was around the unit, and it would have taken someone longer than a few seconds it took whatever this thing was to get away from the window and disappear completely, especially since they were right by his bedroom window, just a foot or two away. The sounds he heard seemed to come from all sides of the house, leading him to suspect that it might have been raccoons. A few days after that, his friends came over and they started complaining about a foul odor reminiscent of rotten fish or flesh. After about 5 days, the strange smell faded away on its own. That night, he found himself still awake at about 2:30 a.m. and was overcome by the strange impulse to leave his room and hide, so he crept out and tucked himself behind the wall that connected his room to the kitchen. Out of nowhere, something hit the wall next to his window, resulting in a loud bang. It was the same area his gut feeling urged him to avoid. He stood frozen in the kitchen, gripped by fear, as he heard many loud bangs, the sound of something running, and trash cans crashing all over around the house, even on the roof. Finally, he managed to gather the courage to grab his computer and began to frantically search for what could possibly be happening. In his research, he found skinwalkers and discovered that these creatures are often seen as coyotes, wolves, foxes, eagles, owls, deer, or crows. His grandmother even spotted either a wolf or coyote on her way to visit him. It has also been said that they emit a scent reminiscent of decay due to their flesh, and they tend to attempt to break into homes or harass people with the various sounds mentioned. Throughout this whole ordeal, he felt like this being or beings were trying to lure him outside his home by imitating a woman's voice. The day he posted his story online, he said the smell was back and he doesn't know how to ward these things off. He has a few interesting details in the comments as well, mentioning that the sounds he heard coming from outside resembled human wails and groans. He learned that skinwalkers often use such tactics to lure people outside. He also remembered that during his first encounter, they attempted to imitate a woman's voice to coax him outside. After conducting some research, he discovered that he resides in a state which is rich in Native American history, and his lineage includes a significant amount of Native American ancestry. If he lives in Native American territory with rich history, then he could perhaps be dealing with a skinwalker. Everything he says about them is true based on what I've heard and learned about them. They appear as a wide variety of animals, primarily a coyote or wolf, which is again based on what I've learned in my research and stories that I've heard, and they definitely like to harass people outside their homes. This includes antics described in this story, such as them running around the outside of the homes and either tapping or banging on the side of it. I've also heard stories where they even get on people's roofs. Also, mimicking voices to try and lure people outside is another tactic used by these creatures that comes up over and over. These are usually people screaming in terror, heard in the woods, or even crying out for help. However, I will say that these tactics are used by other cryptids as well. Dogmen and Sasquatches have been known to bang on exterior walls and do similar things around homes too. Wendigos, crawlers, Witchuge, and even Sasquatches, among others, can mimic. The smell he describes is also associated with many types of cryptids during encounters. One commenter mentioned that if it is skinwalkers around his home, putting bullets and ashes and using them against the supposed skinwalkers will get rid of them. This isn't the first time I've heard of this. If that's what he's dealing with, this could work. Also, cryptids seem to like to know that they are getting to people, so ignoring them usually works as well. But I have heard that when a skinwalker picks a target, they don't stop. What do you think this young man is dealing with? Also, how should he handle it? The next story comes to us from a poster who shares a terrifying experience she had with an unknown creature. This is one of the creepiest stories I've heard in a while and is even backed up by physical evidence the next day. The original poster was about 7 years old when this happened and says it is something she will never forget. One night she had gotten out of bed to get a drink of water. It was pitch black as she ventured into the kitchen, flipping on the light with the intention of enjoying some TV afterward since it wasn't a school night. However, as soon as she stepped foot onto the living room carpet, an eerie sensation crept over her as if something was watching her. Alone in the room with her family asleep in their respective rooms, she tried to dismiss the feeling. The window behind the couch revealed nothing but darkness, offering no cause for alarm. She reached for the remote on the couch's arm, but the feeling only grew stronger. She glanced at the window then, wishing the unsettling sensation would just fade away. But what she saw was a face in the window peering in at her. It was pale and had a wide grin that she says looked painful. Its pupils were so tiny that they were barely visible. One of his fingers was dragging across the window, creating a chilling scraping sound that broke the silence of the otherwise still night. The figure was entirely white, eliciting a cold sweat from her as her face grew hot. She couldn't tell that if her heart was racing so fast that she couldn't feel it, or if it had simply stopped and her stomach dropped. She stood there, paralyzed by fear, unable to move. They had many neighbors nearby, but there shouldn't have been anyone awake at that hour, especially anyone who looked like that. Then it hit the window and she couldn't help but scream before dashing off to her parents' room. But when she got there, she saw it right outside their window, staring at her with its grin somehow stretching even wider than it had been before. Her mother, who's usually a light sleeper, didn't wake up when she screamed again, while her father remained oblivious in his deep slumber. Climbing into their bed, she buried herself under the covers, listening to the unsettling sounds of its nails tapping and scraping against the glass. Time dragged on, and she lay there for what felt like an eternity before she finally fell asleep. When she woke up the next day, she found herself alone in her parents' bed. She leapt out of it, she says, as if it were on fire, and sprinted to the living room window. To her shock, there were scratches on the outside of the window that hadn't been there before. She tried to convince herself it was just a bad dream. Surely it had to be. But how could there be marks on the window where something had been clawing at it if it had been just a dream? She went back and inspected her parents' window and noticed faint scratches in the glass. After she moved from that house, she spent years trying to make sense of it all. Now at 21, she can still vividly recall the encounter and the fear that she felt that night. She ends by saying she posted her story online knowing that she probably wouldn't be believed, but she just had to get it off of her chest. Unfortunately, this is something I hear a lot, with someone posting their story online because they just needed to get it off their chest and they know that no one will believe them. They have to hold their encounter in, feeling like they can't tell anyone, and it builds over time. I'm just glad she found an avenue to get her story off her chest, and hopefully that will help her let it go. As for her encounter, looking over and seeing a face in the window would terrify anyone, I'm sure, especially a 7-year-old. But for it to have a creepy grin as well, that is beyond disturbing. Then on top of that, for it to start scratching on the window and then follow you to another room and doing the same thing, no wonder this poor girl was traumatized by this encounter. Then the next day, for her to want to chalk it up to a nightmare only to find physical evidence in the way of scratches on both windows, that would stay with just about anyone. I'm just glad she never saw this thing again and didn't have any more encounters after that. I believe what she saw that night was either a crawler or a wendigo based on how she described it. But based on the grin, I'd lean toward a wendigo. This thing obviously had a very wide mouth, and to her mind as a child, the look on its face could have resembled a grin even if it wasn't. Wendigos are said to have very wide mouths with very visible teeth that are usually described as being pointed and or sharp. Now, she doesn't say where her story takes place, so if it wasn't somewhere cold or it wasn't during the winter, it was probably something else and not a wendigo. What do you think was looking at her through the window that night? And what would you do if you saw something looking in at you? The next story comes from a poster who had a scary encounter outside of his tent while camping one night. This story takes place in 2021 in Rocky Mountain National Park. Rocky Mountain National Park is located in northern Colorado, about 55 miles northwest of Denver. It is in the Front Range of the Rocky Mountains and sits between the towns of Estes Park and Grand Lake. It covers a total area of 265,461 acres, which is 414.78 square miles or 1,074.28 square kilometers. After packing his belongings, the original poster informed his wife that he'd be back in a few days, jumped in his car, and hit the road. He drove until he found a suitable parking spot, locked the car, and set off on foot. The trail was relatively easy, with just a few fallen trees and a minor rock scramble to navigate. As he walked, he spotted a small clearing off the path and decided to investigate. It turned out to be an ideal location for him to camp in. The only drawback was the hard ground, which caused him to break 4 of his tent stakes. As he set up his tent, a light rain began to fall, but he wasn't worried. He planned to put up a tarp to create a cozy space for a small fire and for him to be able to relax. Once the tent was up and his gear was stowed inside, he hung the tarp and gathered as much dry kindling as wood as he could find. While cooking his dinner, the rain intensified, but the atmosphere was so serene and calming that he felt like he could stay there forever. The sun had set, his fire was fading, and the rain was falling steadily, prompting him to call it a night. He crawled into his tent, inflated his sleeping pad and pillow, and settled into his sleeping bag. The rhythmic sound and earthy scent of rain tapping on the tent always lulled him to sleep. However, around 2 a.m., he heard what seemed like a deer wandering through his campsite, but he brushed it off since deer are usually harmless. But that's when a voice broke the silence. It called out "hey" twice before saying his name. That jolted him awake, and he quickly grabbed his flashlight from his belt, which was resting near his head, and flicked it on. He unzipped the tent slightly, scanning the area, but saw nothing. He zipped his tent back up, convincing himself that it had just been his imagination. As he tried to settle back in, the voice called out again, this time saying "hey," his name again, and then "hey" 2 more times. He decided then that he needed to investigate. He threw on his pants, slipped into his rain jacket, laced up his boots, and grabbed his flashlight and knife. Stepping out of the tent, he scanned his surroundings. But there was absolutely nothing in sight. He checked around the tarp, near the restroom area, and along the trail, but found absolutely nothing. At that point, he was completely on edge. Darkness enveloped him, rain was pouring down, and he found himself alone about 100 yards from the trail. He might have stayed awake all night, but the chill in the air drove him back into his sleeping bag, where he eventually drifted off. The following morning, he got dressed and stepped outside to find deer tracks scattered all around his campsite, and his small stash of firewood, which he had tucked up under his tarp, was strewn everywhere. That was enough for him. He quickly packed up his gear, made sure to leave nothing behind, and hurried back to his car. He kept reassuring himself that it was just a deer, but he couldn't shake off the feeling of something calling out his name. He did plan to return to that same spot in the summer, or perhaps he would bring a friend along for company. I think the only thing worse than hearing something around your tent and knowing it's out there would be for it to call out your name. This is disturbing for many reasons, but the main one I can think of is how in the world did it even know his name in the first place? It was not like anyone else was there with him to call him by his name and whatever was out there to overhear them saying it. He was alone, and I'm pretty sure not walking around calling himself by his own name. I've heard many stories where mimics call out to someone in a family member or a friend's voice, except the voice being used by the mimic belongs to someone that isn't even close to the location where the encounter is taking place. One instance that comes to mind is when a young man heard his grandmother's voice calling out for help within the forest. The only problem with that was his grandmother was at home halfway across the country, and he was well aware of this fact. How would the mimic even know her voice, let alone know the person was the grandmother of the man it was trying to lure into the woods? Now, we don't know for sure that it was a mimic in this story because the poster doesn't describe the voice, but it certainly sounds like one to me. When he says he found deer prints the next day, this made me think of two distinct cryptids with hooves, those being Goatman and Wichuge. Both have hooved feet and both can mimic. I will mention that Rocky Mountain National Park is in Colorado, which is near the southwestern United States, where there is a very large population of Navajo people and a lot of skinwalker encounters take place. One of the forms skinwalkers take is that of a deer, so it's very possible that it could have been one. However, Rocky Mountain National Park is located in the northern part of Colorado, so take that with a grain of salt. What do you think this was? And what would you do if you were camping and something called out your name in the middle of the night? The final story of this episode comes to us from a poster who tells the story of his father's sighting of a creature outside his home. He lives on the border of the Cascade Mountain Range and is surrounded by park and federal land. The Cascade Mountain Range extends 700 miles from north to south, from British Columbia, Canada, down through Washington State, Oregon, and into Northern California. Its highest peak is Mount Rainier in Washington, which reaches an elevation of 14,411 feet, or 4,392 meters. His father woke up one night to the sound of dogs barking, quickly understanding that they were reacting to something moving alongside the road. As his own dog joined in, he stepped outside to investigate. The view across the street was dominated by dense forest, with only a church directly across the street from his house on a gravel lot. Although his father was too far away to catch a glimpse of anything, the unmistakable sound of someone or something sprinting across the gravel echoed through the stillness of the night. Several aspects of the situation left him feeling unsettled. First, whatever it was definitely moved on two legs. He could easily distinguish the sound of a dog on gravel from that of a person. What he heard that night, whatever it was, ran upright on two legs. The thing he heard was also quite large. He and his son had seen large creatures like bears and moose running through the brush, and he claimed that the noise that it made was comparable to those animals. The second thing that made him feel uneasy about it was that it was sprinting at a speed of about 40 to 50 miles per hour in the open area before it slowed down upon re-entering the forest. He was able to gauge this thing's speed based on the road he lived on having a speed limit of 45 miles per hour, and whatever was running out there was keeping the pace of vehicles that passed his home going the speed limit. The last thing that gave him the unsettling feeling was the sound of this thing's heavy breathing. It was inhaling and panting so loud that he could hear it from his front door, and it was clearly not human. He and his son later searched online to find similar animal sounds, but nothing matched what he experienced that night. The original poster closes by saying that the freakiest part of the whole ordeal for his father was how all the dogs reacted to this thing at the exact same time. He told his son he had never heard anything like that before. He ends by saying that his entire family and neighbors have heard the dogs bark like that, but only his father heard whatever this thing was that they were barking at. When I first read this story, I thought that the father could have heard just a person running down the road and then across the gravel lot. But then he laid out the bizarre circumstances surrounding what happened. All the neighborhood dogs reacting the same exact way at the same exact time, this thing being large and heavy, the speed in which it ran, and the breathing all made me think that there is more to this than just a person running down the road. Then there is where he lives, on the border of the Cascade Mountain Range, which is known for all kinds of bizarre stories, many of which involve cryptids. There's also the fact that the home is surrounded by park and federal land, which are normally hotspots for encounters and activity. Based on how big he says this thing was, as well as the loud footsteps and breathing, I'm guessing this was a Sasquatch. Other types of cryptids are much more quiet when they run. There's just something about this story that makes me think Sasquatch, but I could be wrong. What do you think he caught running down the road that night? Was it a cryptid? Was it just a person? Or was it something else? And that's going to do it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed these stories. If you'd like to hear more stories like these and other types of cryptids, make sure to subscribe to the channel. If you want to send me your story, I'd love to read it. My email is wolfwhocriedcryptid@gmail.com. I will also put it in the description below. With your permission, I may want to use it in an episode. Even if you'd prefer that I didn't share your story on my channel and just want someone to listen, email me. We can privately talk about your encounter. And please remember to keep it civil in the comments section. No one deserves to be ridiculed whether they believe or not. Thank you for listening. I'll catch you at the next episode.